Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Peter Alexander. You are looking at President Biden there finishing his remarks in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania on the issue of crime. He sought to reframe the narrative on Democrats in crime, calling to fund the police, not to defund it. He touted recent successes, including bipartisan gun legislation. And as you heard just seconds ago, he took aim at Republicans. My MAGA Republican friends, he described them, invoking the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th and criticizing those Republicans who have not denounced and condemned those attacks. He said, for God's sakes, whose side are you on? He also criticized Republican attacks on the FBI following its search of the president's home, the former president's home in Florida. We're going to talk a lot more about President Biden's remarks in just a moment from now. But the bottom line here, with exactly 10 weeks until midterms and control of the Congress on the line, the White House is signaling it is not holding back on a new line of attacks on the GOP. President Biden speaking after his first midterm season rally last week, where he called elements of the hard right semi-fascism while speaking with a group of donors. It comes as President Biden is ramping up his travel schedule. It's going to return to Pennsylvania again later this week. On Thursday, he'll deliver a primetime speech from Philadelphia's Independence Hall. A White House official telling NBC News that address will be framed as a, quote, continued battle for the soul of the nation. A direct parallel, of course, to his 2020 campaign kickoff in Philadelphia, where then candidate Biden offered himself as a defender of democracy against President Trump. Now, with Mr. Trump not on the ballot himself in November, the White House is trying to tie Republicans who are to Trump's ideology. The speech Thursday is expected to invoke the fight for personal rights, likely an emphasis on the ongoing abortion rights fight in the country, an issue that has already helped to galvanize Democrats and grown that gap between Democrats and Republicans in this country. Also led to some Republican candidates scrambling to try to moderate, even to backpedal, erase if they could, their positions after election results in Kansas and in upstate New York this month. And yet the president's travel blitz comes as Democrats remain hesitant to attach themselves to him, according to new reporting from NBC News. Case in point, even on his home turf of Pennsylvania this week, Democratic Senate candidate John Fetterman, who's facing Republican nominee Dr. Mehmet Oz, is not appearing at the Wilkes-Barre event. But a Fetterman spokesperson said he will be talking to Biden in Pittsburgh when the president visits on Labor Day. President Biden expected to be there for the Labor Day parade. Gubernatorial candidate Josh Shapiro, who's running against the far-right GOP candidate Doug Mastriano, will only be appearing in, quote, his official capacity as Attorney General, his spokesperson told NBC News. Their caution reflects what is shaping up to be a highly unusual midterm year, where so many of the old rules of midterm politics are being questioned. And joining me now to talk about all of it, to preview the road ahead for the president, is NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba. Also with me, senior national political reporter Natasha Korecki and Capitol Hill reporter for us, fortunately at NBC News, Sahil Kapoor. Monica, let me get to you. We just saw the president back out on the trail in Pennsylvania. He'll be there 3 times over 7 days. What struck you in this speech? Clearly, the president's trying to flip the script on the Republican narrative on crime, but it was the end. It was the punctuation, the exclamation point, you might say. But the president really laid into those Republicans on this issue to close out his remarks.
Absolutely, Peter. That's what stood out to me as well. The fact that the president had been talking about these crime prevention programs, but then at the end, he really wanted to make the contrast the clearest he could possibly in these terms. And we were told by the White House that he was going to be fiery and a bit more aggressive than he has been maybe out on the trail today, and that was certainly the case. I want to read to you just a couple of those quotes that we are emphasizing and talking about here when he said, "Don't tell me you support law enforcement if you won't condemn what happened on January 6th. Whose side are you on? You're either on the side of the mob or you're on the side of the police," emphasizing you can't be pro-law enforcement and pro-insurrection. So
Monica, let me cut you off briefly. I want to play that sound. We just put it together. The president saying it just moments ago, so folks who missed it can hear it for themselves. Here, there's that soundbite.
So let me say this to my MAGA Republican friends in Congress. Don't tell me you support law enforcement if you won't condemn what happened on the 6th. Don't tell me. Can't do it. For God's sake, whose side are you on?
A little bit of fire from the president on this issue, certainly.
Absolutely, and this is something that we know the president had planned to talk about for some time. This event was supposed to take place about a month ago. He was already scheduled to be in Wilkes-Barre, and then he got COVID, and then he had that rebound infection, so he was off the trail for most of August. But what's notable also about today is a new strategy that the White House went after, and that's because of everything we saw happen in the last couple of weeks with the lawfully executed FBI search and seizure down at Mar-a-Lago, because former President Trump took classified documents from the White House to his residence. So in the context of all of that following, some Republicans and some of the former president's supporters had been calling to defund the FBI. So President Biden took the opportunity today to really express what he said was sickening about those recent threats to FBI, and that he said again, of course, the FBI was carrying out their duty and following the law. So it's notable that he also had that line of attack against some Republicans, because that's obviously not something that would have taken place a month ago. So the White House trying out this multi-pronged strategy, talking about crime, talking about law and order, but also specifically, Peter, about gun violence, and the president reiterating that he does want to ban all assault weapons. We know that wasn't something that was part of the bipartisan gun legislation that was signed earlier this year, but that is something that the president wants to be able to do, and that he said he's going to continue to call out any Republicans who don't support that ahead of the November midterms.
You know, Monica, even some Republican strategists that I spoke to over the course of the last several days said they couldn't wrap their head around why any Republicans would have been touting that early line, defund the FBI, despite their frustration about the siege, as it were, with a search warrant that took place at the former president's home a bit earlier. But this does sort of offer a runway to what we think we're going to hear from the president when he speaks from Philadelphia in front of Independence Hall on Thursday. This is the Soul of the Nation speech. Again, it seems like that's sort of a further amplification of this issue about freedoms and rights being at stake, and also trying to draw that contrast between his administration and these MAGA Republicans.
That's certainly correct, Peter. And the president is going to be talking about this, we're told, in broader strokes. He's going to zoom out and really put into the bigger picture what's at stake here for, in the words of a White House official, protecting our rights, protecting our freedoms, and protecting our democracy. So they're going to do that by sort of using the old campaign slogan, the battle for the soul of the nation, but with a bit of a remix, and trying to update it ahead of the midterm elections as a sort of testing ground, again, for that strategy. So the president is going to be evoking our founding fathers, talking, of course, at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and he's also going to be talking about what he feels he's been able to make some progress on when it comes to preserving democracy in the last 2 years of his administration, but all the work he feels that still needs to be done. And notably there, he did talk a little bit about America's standing on the world stage. That's something I'm also told he's going to be referencing on Thursday, and trying to make the point that he wants to be able to make these statements to other world leaders that he feels America is back. Notable there that he disclosed that French President Emmanuel Macron replied to him when he said that recently, for how long, Peter? Yeah, it's a good point, Monica. I got to tell you, having seen the president when he was on the departing of Marine One on Friday, there's sort of a swagger to this president right now that you haven't seen in a while, a sense of confidence. They're feeling good about where things are, about gas prices coming down, about some other things going their way, the legislative achievements that they've had over the course of the last several months, including that giant climate change plan. Natasha, I want to bring you into this conversation. You have new reporting today, though, that some Democrats, despite all of that, are still a bit hesitant to campaign with the president, even after this slate of wins. So sort of help us understand the current dynamic right now between President Biden and those Democratic campaigns.
Sure thing. I mean, the most obvious reason right now is, even though Biden has had this streak of wins, lots of legislative wins, lots of great headlines, his poll numbers are still not as high as Democrats. They're really in the 40s still. And in these battleground states, these Senate candidates in particular are really fighting for their campaigns, and they're outperforming Biden. So that's a real simple answer. But, other things that campaigns have told us is they like this narrative now. They like where they're headed. They like that extremism is on the ballot, and they want to keep that narrative intact. They don't want to go anywhere near gas prices, even though they are going up, still not great, or inflation and the economy, all issues that are, one of the top issues for voters. But as we talk about some of what Biden's going into on Thursday and beyond, I mean, this is really Biden's sweet spot. He wants to talk about democracy. He wants to go back to the 2020 race. And I've had lots of Democratic strategists say they feel like the GOP is sort of playing into their hands. I mean, it's like, one example after another, and they love the fact that Trump continues to be in the news. So all of these things are good for Democrats, but still, Democrats don't feel like they're good enough to really be on stage one-on-one right next to Biden. They don't want to open themselves up to attacks because every state is so different than what we're looking at nationally.
Yeah, so much of this is case by case, district by district, state by state. As you note there, Natasha, I want to play for a moment something that struck me in the president's remarks. He appeared to be reacting to the words of the Republican senator from South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, who just a couple of days ago, I think late Sunday, indicated that if President Trump is indicted for his mishandling of classified documents, that there would be riots in the street. Notably, those comments coming just 20 months after January 6th took place in this country. Here's the president's apparent reaction to those words. Listen.
No one expects politics to be a patty cake. It sometimes gets mean as hell. But the idea you turn on a television and see senior senators and congressmen saying, if such and such happens, there'll be blood in the street. Where the hell are we?
Sahil Kapoor is joining us. Sahil, I want your take on that. That was, the two men, Lindsey Graham and Joe Biden, they were friendly for a long time. Obviously, a lot changed over the course of the last several years, but this was a pretty good slam at his former colleague across the aisle.
Yes, Peter, it was an emphatic condemnation of what he described as MAGA Republicans, this violent rhetoric that, President Biden seemed to come alive on when, denouncing it. He talked about the riot on this Capitol on January 6th, repeatedly talked about the so-called MAGA Republicans who soft-pedaled that. Some of them, at least some on the far right, called those who marched on the Capitol patriots. Some of them downplayed it. There were talks of, among certain House Republicans calling it a tourist visit. Which is a preposterous claim, but Biden repeatedly went after Republicans for making those claims and connected it to his broader arc on crime. He was around in the 80s and 90s. He knows how devastating attacks on crime can be to the Democratic Party when they're perceived as, being on the wrong side of it. And this was his attempt to kind of snuff that out early on and flip that narrative by talking about the Trump-allied Republicans who have not emphatically condemned the attack on the Capitol. He also talked about, defunding the police. He's always been against that ever since that first came out in 2020. He reiterated his position on that, but he also said he's against defunding the FBI, something that certain allies of Trump, including some right-wing members of the House of Representatives, have said in the wake of that search of Mar-a-Lago. So it's an attempt by the president to flip the narrative, but he seemed quite, unusually passionate when talking about that. He ended by mentioning, where in God's name is the old United States of America? Let's get back to that. That was the most vintage Biden line of that speech, I thought.
Yeah, no doubt. I think that gives us a pretty good template, as it were, for what we're going to hear from the president over the course of the next 70 days, now 10 weeks out to those midterms. Sahil, Monica, Natasha, I appreciate all your expertise and your reporting today. Thank you. And we turn now from the current president's remarks to some of the legal issues facing the former president. This afternoon, the Justice Department will file its official response to Donald Trump's request for a special master to oversee items recovered by the FBI at Mar-a-Lago. In fact, they have till midnight tonight, could be a few hours still. We're expecting a lot of potentially new information and arguments from the government as the Justice Department had to get special permission to make this filing 40 pages long, twice the limit set by local rules. The department says 20 pages simply was not adequate to address the legal and factual issues raised by the former president. The judges have scheduled a Thursday hearing to address the issue, naming a third party, the special master, to oversee the documents. He stated previously that he is likely to appoint one. Meanwhile, Fulton County, Georgia's DA says that her criminal investigation into potential interference in the 2020 election should be wrapped up by the end of the year. A bunch of headlines to chew on. We're joined now by Ryan Riley. Fortunately, he covers the Justice Department for NBC News. Also with me is Harry Littman, former U.S. attorney and now L.A. Times legal affairs columnist. We've got two guys who know this as well as anybody. Ryan, let's start with you quickly if we can. So we know that this is going to be 40 pages long. First of all, it doesn't really matter in some case what they do about the special master at this point because the DOJ has already had several weeks to review a lot of this information. They've made their own assessments about where privilege may exist. But what do those 40 pages, the existence of 40 pages, tell us about what's coming?
Well, DOJ likes to speak through filings, and I think the fact that they are asking for 40 pages here indicates that they're going to sprinkle a lot of news nuggets in this. They're basically going to lay out why they don't think a special master is necessary. And I think that, it's important to remember here the taint team is separate. They've already been walled off from this investigation. So, even though they've already looked through these records that would be protected by attorney-client privilege, the team that would be handling any prosecutorial decisions wouldn't have actually seen any of those documents because it's a separate entity within the FBI and DOJ. So there is a little bit of separation here. But, I think what DOJ in the main is going to try to focus on is that this idea that they have to limit this to just being about attorney-client privilege documents. They can't expand beyond that. If there is a special master put in place, the mandate should be pretty clear that if this is only about attorney-client privilege, this isn't about executive privilege or anything else that Donald Trump would essentially try to bring into this to complicate the issue and delay things, Peter.
And Harry, to give us a better understanding, pull back the curtain a bit. Is this filing really about preventing the appointment of a special master, or perhaps more about informing the American people about the Justice Department standoff with Mr. Trump? They could reveal a lot of information here through this avenue, through this venue.
They could. It's a little bit about that, I think, Peter. And then actually, I think there is going to be a sustained effort to try to push her back from the brink of potentially having a special master. Not that the special master itself would be such a disaster, but the worry is that somehow she would endorse the Trump idea, which is what he's been trying to sell all the way through, that there's executive privilege here, and that would torpedo everything. If it's just about attorney-client privilege, they don't need it here. As you say, the taint team has already gone through it. And by the way, if there's a mistake, it's the consequences for DOJ are severe. That attorney gets taken off the case. So everything's in place for a very simple process. It's laid out under the warrant to deal with attorney-client privilege. What I think they'll try to do in the first instance is sort of walk her back from the idea that there could be executive privilege here. And then second, I agree, they have a chance, Trump is again led with his chin, to respond to some of the false assertions in his two filings and reassure the American people that the FBI was not the jackbooted thugs here, but very, very, very patient negotiators with Trump until it was impossible not to come in and get the document.
Harry, help me understand this, because obviously we can only base our understanding on what we got in January, right? What the president turned over, the former president turned over then, that included 184 pages of classified documents, including 25 that were top secret. Now they want to talk about the 11 boxes of documents that they seized when they were there just a matter of weeks ago this month in August. So, I mean, can there be attorney-client privilege over classified documents? The president wouldn't be talking to Pat Cipollone or his attorneys about that sort of information. That information normally comes from the intelligence community and beyond, doesn't it?
Totally. There's no way, 6 ways from Sunday. Biden has already made clear that he's waived it. Even if he hadn't, it's the executive branch getting its own information back. This was the sort of cagey idea that Trump used to try to parry and keep the archives at bay. And the whole point was there's no executive privilege here. That's why we're telling the FBI and DOJ. And if he were somehow able to revive this notion, which has been rejected by every level of the federal courts, then we'd be, in that'd be the major monkey wrench. Otherwise, if she wants to appoint a special master for attorney-client, no big deal.
So, Ryan, let me ask you about the Attorney General, Merrick Garland. He issued this new memo today. It instructs non-career DOJ employees not to attend any political events. I want to read in part what it says. He says, as department employees, we have been entrusted with the authority and responsibility to enforce the laws of the United States in a neutral and impartial manner. In fulfilling this responsibility, we must do all we can to maintain public trust and ensure that politics, both in fact and appearance, does not compromise or affect the integrity of our work. It's an easy thing to say, but this is a tough thing for the Justice Department to do right now. The timing of this, is it coincidental? Can you talk about the messaging behind that? We saw Merrick Garland talk to our colleague Lester Holt only a matter of weeks ago, where he basically said, you know, we got to do this without fear or favor. We just got to judge the facts as we see them.
Yeah, I think, Merrick Garland has always been consistent about not wanting politics to interfere with DOJ's mission. But I do think a big part of this is messaging and making sure essentially that you're not giving the department's critics any ammo in the upcoming months, because we've seen all these attacks that have been going on for months and months against the Justice Department, years and years, in fact, in the Trump administration, attacks against the Justice Department. So essentially, they don't want any viral moments, anything that pop up on social media that's going to look good, that's going to look bad, rather, for a Justice Department employee engaged in some sort of politics, even though this would have been allowed under a previous iteration of the DOJ rules, that you could potentially go to, say a victory party on election night, or if your spouse is running for office, you could actually participate in some ways in that campaign. So I think they're basically making sure that the message is no politics. We're not going to give any ammo to DOJ critics here to be used against DOJ at this critical time.
Yeah, some of this based on past experience from the last go-around, the president teeing off on a lot of those former FBI agents and Justice Department officials who had some connection to the politics that surrounds everything in Washington as well. Ryan Riley, we appreciate you. Harry Littman, thanks so much, Harry, for being with us. Thank you so much for your time today. Much more after this. We're going to be back after a very short break. Welcome back. You're watching Meet the Press. Now, President Biden on the offensive on the campaign trail, hoping to turn legislative successes into Democratic votes in November. We heard some of those attack lines previewed a bit earlier in the show, so let's dive right in. And joining me now is our panel, Politico congressional reporter Nicholas Wu, Democratic strategist Xochitl Hinojosa, Republican strategist Todd. I call you Soch when I see you.
Soch,
right?
It's fine.
Yes,
yep.
Thank you. That was your full name. I'm not always used to being so formal in these settings. Let me ask you guys about this very quickly. I want to get your reaction to the speech right now. First, Nicholas, I'll ask you, because it was clear that the president was fired up, and we've heard him being much more aggressive. It feels like they think they have the resume behind them of achievements, the message, the contrast they want to sort of commit their energy toward going into the campaign this fall. What were your takeaways from that?
Well, I think what we're seeing here is the president really taking a much different tack on January 6th and talking about law enforcement than Democrats have previously. I mean, Democrats I've talked to in the past have not seen January 6th as a winning issue heading into the midterms. They would want to talk about other things. But
this is through the lens of crime, right? They're trying to sort of turn the tables on that issue.
Exactly, yeah. And here we have the president coming out and trying to say that Democrats are the party of law enforcement. And in some ways, it kind of calls to mind what some Democrats in tighter re-election races have done. Like, look at, or tighter general election races. Look at Val Demings in Florida, for example, right, who for some time has been talking about how, I don't want to defund the police, I am the police. And here we have Joe Biden coming out and saying he doesn't want to defund the police.
So let me ask you, Brad, about this right now. Is this an issue for the Republicans? Republicans clearly think crime is a winning issue for them right here. Do they separate the issue of crime in their own communities from the FBI? Are those two one and the same, as the president sort of tried to suggest they are?
No, I think they do separate it. And I think, there's no saying in politics, we got a problem, hang a lantern on it. And Democrats did that today with putting Joe Biden on the campaign trail in the Senate race to talk about crime in a race where the nominee, John Fetterman, is under attack for his work on the state parole board. Where he said we're going to let as many folks out as we can. I mean, as Republicans, we're glad to have Joe Biden come to Pennsylvania anytime. We're glad to have him talk about crime in regards to John Fetterman.
As Republicans, though, you got your own issues in the state of Pennsylvania right now, right? It's sort of a GOP problem, as one Republican described it earlier today. Georgia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. You got Herschel Walker has his own issues. Tim Ryan is making things interesting for J.D. Vance in Pennsylvania. Mastriano hasn't made it much easier for the Republicans in that state, and John Fetterman's running away with the race, it appears.
Well, if Democrats were really comfortable with Pennsylvania was done, they wouldn't send the president there today. And by the way, he did mix up the two candidates. I don't know if you noticed that at the end of the speech.
That's true.
He wasn't quite sure who was there to campaign for or what they're running for. And again, Joe Biden is the Democrats' problem. And the more he's front and center in campaign 2022, the better it is for Republicans.
So, Soch, is this the right move for Democrats? Should they be embracing the president or be at arm's length from the president right now? We didn't see Fetterman today. We'll see him at the parade on Labor Day. We saw Josh Shapiro there. He's running for governor in the state, the AG, Attorney General, saying he was there in his official capacity, not as a campaign effort. What's the best strategy for Democrats?
I think that Democrats should use President Biden. He clearly won Pennsylvania. There are areas where Democrats are leading in the polls, and I think it is smart for President Biden to go. I'll also say that addressing the issue of crime is definitely a change from what we saw in 2020. For a long time, Republicans ran with defund the police. Democrats want to defund the police. It took a really long time for Democrats to respond to that, and it took off for a while. So the fact that the president is coming in, he knows what vulnerabilities are. He knows what Americans want to see, and he's addressing it and saying, yeah, we don't want to defund the police. We don't want to defund the FBI. We actually want to keep communities safe, and we want to fund them, and we want to continue to pass legislation like his gun bill to keep communities safe.
Also trying to demonstrate that in his economic stimulus last year, there was a lot of money that went to state and local governments as it relates to that issue. It's a message the White House keeps indicating they want to make sure is understood
and as
in those communities.
Kids are going back to school right now, too, and that's the number one issue in schools right now.
Let me ask you, if I can, Nicholas, about the approval rating, right? We keep a close eye on the numbers. Obviously, it seems like why the White House feels so good right now, because numbers have grown up to about 45% in some polls for the president. He was hovering in the 38% range not too many months ago right now. You can see those figures. I think the job approval from NBC's poll a couple weeks ago was 42%, 55% disapproving. It's not exactly something to wrap your arms around right now, but the White House feels like it's the trajectory that matters. They feel like they're going in the right direction now. Is that the message Americans are sort of receiving from this White House?
It seems to be very much the case. I mean, looking at some of these approval numbers, these gains are coming among independents who previously had expressed disapproval of the president and now slowly but surely seem to be swinging the other way. Now, the question is whether this is going to be enough to turn things around for Democrats before the midterms. Previously, these approval ratings were in the kind of territory where it would drag down a lot of incumbents. But, now if we're in the 40-something% range, some people might have more of a fighting chance.
It's sort of an interesting world where 40% is like, oh, that could actually help. I mean, the way politics has become so divisive in this country, 40% sometimes is celebrated as you're in the right place right now. Brad, let me ask you, for Republicans' purposes, what is the fundamental thing that they need to get across right now? It feels like increasingly they're playing defense on issues like abortion rights. They have to find a better job of sort of pressing Democrats on where they view limits for abortion rights and the like. But on a lot of these issues, as we witnessed in Kansas and we witnessed in upstate New York, Republicans have been playing defense on issues where they were hoping to be playing offense.
I think, first of all, the cost of living is up, and Democrats run everything in Washington. That's the campaign, and Republicans will be...
Is that the campaign?
That's the campaign. Republicans certainly are going to fight out other issues as well, but that's the campaign. You're not happy with what the cost of living in the United States is. You're not happy with the economic situation. You're not happy we have a commander-in-chief that doesn't seem to do well at foreign affairs. Then Democrats are in charge of everything, and you need to have divided government. The independents...
The president hasn't done well on foreign affairs, you're referring to...
He's still defined by the Afghanistan debacle. He's about to do an Iran deal that's going to put our ally Israel in jeopardy.
Do Americans not give the president credit for what's going on in Russia right now, that the president has helped sort of rebuild the NATO alliance that was effectively shattered in the last administration?
The NATO alliance has been intact no matter what. Republicans have always supported it.
Was it intact
Republicans
4 years
have long
ago?
supported the NATO alliance. Absolutely. Hasn't changed.
Well, the Republican former president didn't, I guess. So is Donald Trump help or hurt your effort right now?
Well, I think that Donald Trump is not the subject of this election. We never have elections about previous presidents.
He sure has tried to make it so.
We only have elections about the current president in the midterm. They always are. He may want it to be that. Democrats may want it to be that. That's not the way it's ever worked. Elections in the midterm are a referendum on the president and his party. That's what's going to happen in November.
So is this a referendum or is this a choice?
I think that Democrats are laying it out as a choice between what they've accomplished and how they have made progress for the American people. And while I agree with you that this election is about the economy, Republicans are not focused on the economy. There are so many distractions right now with the Republican Party, and they can't, and especially if you're looking at their candidates in some of these states who have been untested and have their own distractions. And so they're not getting their message across on the economy. It's actually Democrats who are out there saying, you know what? Look at everything that we have done for you. And I would say typical year, absolutely. Republicans should run with that message, but they're not because of the untested candidates they have in these states.
Well, it's why you see it's only like 2-point advantage for Republicans right now in the most recent generic ballot. Obviously, we got 2 months to go here. But, Nicholas, talk about that issue. Rich Lowry was at this desk with me over the weekend. We were on Meet the Press together, and he said something that struck me. He said, what's going on at Mar-a-Lago right now is good for Donald Trump, right? Because it throws him into the headlines. And again, it's good for Democrats. It's not good for the Republicans. Republicans have clearly, and there weren't a lot of Republicans out on Friday trying to defend what's going on. Their Republicans have largely tried to distance themselves from their former president.
Right, as my colleagues and I reported this morning, there is a fair amount of concern among Republicans and frustration, really, that this is the kind of thing that they're being forced to talk about right now. This is the thing that Republican lawmakers will be asked about when they come back to Capitol Hill in a few weeks, rather than the things that they would prefer to talk about, inflation, gas prices, and the like, right? Instead, they're being asked to defend the president's conduct, or, in many ways, this feels like some of the other years of the Trump presidency, right? Where, again, Republicans would like to talk about one thing, but Trump inserts himself into the headlines.
Brad, we've talked about this. It was initially going to be a Republican wave, right? This red wave. Now some say it might be a ripple. Where do you see? What is your real assessment of where this thing stands right now with 10 weeks to go?
Well, in 2010, the last time Republicans took Congress, I did a lot of work on the House side. Yeah. And if you look at the generic ballot on Election Day in 2010, Republicans were up by 2 points. We gained 63 seats. I don't think we're going to gain even half of that 63-seat number this year. But it's going to be a great night for Republicans. Republicans are going to gain control of the House. I think.
What's a great night? Is great night? I mean, is winning majority?
20-seat gain, so you have a 15-seat majority somewhere in that neighborhood. Yeah. And so I think that's where we're headed.
A lot of the prognosticators say it's a lot closer than that.
I think we're headed to a 20-seat gain. 25 is not out of the question. Maybe it's more likely than 15 is. But somewhere in that range, which means you end up with a Republican majority that can run the House. One problem we have as Republicans is a very narrow majority would be impossible. Republicans we don't herd well. And so if you end up with a 4 or 5
you should talk to the Democrats.
If you end up with a 4 or 5 seat majority, you won't be able to appoint a chaplain of the day. So you need to get that 15-seat majority, but I think we'll get it.
All right, and we're going to bring the chaplain of the day on set with us tomorrow if we can figure out who that person is. Brad, nice to see you. Nicholas, always. Sochi, nice to see you. Appreciate you coming here and being with us. Next up, the latest in Ukraine, where officials are accusing Russia of constant shelling near Europe's largest nuclear plant and what it means for the United Nations inspectors that are headed there right now. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. UN nuclear inspectors arrived in Kyiv last night for their trip to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant later this week. While in Kyiv today, the delegation met with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky as concerns of a nuclear disaster there keep rising. This morning, both Russia and Ukraine renewed accusations that the other side is shelling around that facility, and both countries are saying that the other is planning a provocation ahead of or during the IAEA visit. An advisor to President Zelensky is also claiming that Russia is deliberately shelling the route that the nuclear inspectors will take to the plant in order to divert them through Russian-held Crimea instead of through Ukrainian-controlled territory. Amid all of this, Senators Amy Klobuchar and Rob Portman made their way to Kyiv today, meeting with President Zelensky, and then going on to visit some of the surrounding neighborhoods there. We also want to share some breaking news that we have just learned. This comes from Moscow. Russian news agency Interfax is reporting that Mikhail Gorbachev has died today. He was 91. He was the last leader of the Soviet Union. According to a statement from the hospital, Gorbachev died after a serious and long illness. And still to come right here, public safety in America's cities. A mayor on the front lines reacting to the president's message on crime as he fights to bring down some of the highest crime rates in the country. That's next right here. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. As we mentioned previously, President Biden spoke about his crime initiatives this afternoon in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. He focused on his policy initiatives to reduce gun violence and to reframe the narrative, trying to paint Democrats as the party working to reduce crime through legislation and through the support of law enforcement.
They see hate and anger and violence just walking the streets of America, and they just want to feel safe again. They want to feel a sense of security. And that's what my crime plan is all about. It's based on a simple notion. When it comes to public safety in this nation, the answer is not defund the police, it's fund the police.
Republicans have spent a lot of this year sounding the alarm on crime rates, hoping it would be a driving issue for voters in these midterms. Violent crime rates rose sharply in 2020 and 2021, but national data from the first half of this year suggests that homicide rates, at least, are on the decline. I'm joined now by the mayor of Cleveland, Ohio, Justin Bibb. He's part of a group of Democratic mayors taking part in a Mayor's Stopping Crime initiative. Mayor Bibb, we appreciate your time. I just want your reaction to what you heard from the president today. The president really trying to cast Democrats as the ones fighting this issue, focusing on the economic stimulus package that was signed last year that really put a lot of money in the hands of local and state jurisdictions to do more to fight crime in their communities.
President Biden has the right message. Us as Democrats and especially as mayors, we believe in funding the police. I'm a son of a cop, and I get both sides of this. I understand the importance of police accountability, but also the importance of investing in good quality law enforcement. Just right here in Cleveland, we just negotiated a new contract for our police officers to give them an 11% raise over the next 3 years. But we're also leading the most progressive police reform agenda in America to make sure we can root out police corruption and ensure long-term accountability in our department.
National homicide stats down, I think, 3+% right now. In Cleveland, I read the homicide rate this year alone down close to 11%. So they're good headlines coming out of your community there. But what do you see as the drivers of crime right now? Obviously, coming out of the pandemic, there were moments, and there were a lot of states, frankly, a lot of states and cities with Democratic mayors, Seattle, Washington, San Francisco, that have had real issues with crime. What's driving it?
Well, first and foremost, it's been the proliferation of guns. We've had a state legislature in the state of Ohio that makes it easier to get a gun than get a certificate or training to be a barber in Ohio. That does not make any sense at all. So we need tougher gun laws in our state. We've also seen a dramatic increase in mental health issues since the pandemic. So more funding to support mental health supports will go a long way to truly root out violent crime, not just in Cleveland, but across the nation.
Mayor, as you know well, there are a lot of Republicans who would push back and say, hey, you got to have prosecutors in these communities who are doing more. They're putting people, they're catching folks and then putting them back on the streets right now, and they're not being tough enough on crime in those communities. Is that an issue that you acknowledge needs to be better addressed to help sort of resolve this?
Absolutely. I truly believe in the importance of criminal justice reform and making sure we give folks a second chance. But when you have repeat offenders who have continuous gun violations on their record, they don't belong on our streets. So it's a balancing act. We have to make sure we have smart, sensible criminal justice reform, but also good law enforcement to keep our streets safe.
So what should the Democratic message on crime be right now? You talk to Republicans. We've had some at this table. I was speaking to some ahead of Meet the Press this past weekend, some strategists saying, the issue of the economy and the issue of crime, those are going to be big drivers. What should the Democrats' message be rebutting that?
I would say, as a Democratic Party, we should say we're going to back the blue, but hold them accountable when they step out of line, and know that we're fighting on the front lines in cities like Cleveland and Tulsa and Kansas City to keep our streets safe by investing in things like education, mental health supports, and ensuring that our children have good things to do as they go back to school this year. That's the best way for Democrats to win come this November.
The president's effort today was to sort of parlay the Republican criticism of the FBI's going into Mar-a-Lago, gathering documents, of course, with a search warrant, basically saying if you're calling to defund the FBI, if you're attacking, the FBI, then you can't be pro-cop and you can't be pro-police. Do Americans do they connect those two things? Is the FBI what people are talking about when they're thinking about crime in their communities?
I think the voters of this country are a lot smarter than most politicians these days. They recognize that we need to do a better job of funding and supporting the FBI, but also supporting law enforcement all across this country. And Democrats must continue to take that message to the voters come November.
Walk me through this. You're a Democratic mayor in a red state. You got a Republican governor there. What have you done that has worked and that could be a message from which other mayors, governors could learn from in other states to sort of overcome those differences? Is the message that you're getting from the state governor's mansion the same as the one that you're seeing in your community? Or are you working together, and what's succeeding?
Well, I have to say this. Although Governor DeWine and I don't agree on a lot of issues, we do agree on using every resource we can in this state to fight violent crime. The governor supported our city with investments in our real-time crime center. We've also deployed our state patrol in Cleveland to get nearly 2,000 guns off the street this year. And so we have to work with Republicans and other folks across the aisle to keep our community safe, because that should be our #1 priority.
Is there capital for an assault-style weapons ban? The president said he's going to work on this however long it takes. We had it in the past, and he's focused on making it happen again. You know, in places like Highland Park, Illinois, after the awful shooting that happened there on the 4th of July, they're working on doing things in their own communities. Those things don't work, though, if you can buy a gun in a different state and cross state lines and come right into your backyard and launch a massacre of just awful proportions. So how do communities like yours overcome those when there isn't the capital in Washington to do something further?
Well, we have to do a better job in cities like Cleveland and across this state to use different tools to track down on these high assault weapons that we see in our city and across the state. And the best capital we have should be our political capital. This November, we have the opportunity to elect common sense Democrats to the United States Senate to make sure we can get real legislation done in D.C. to bring real change to cities like Cleveland. And I'll be knocking on doors the rest of the year to make sure that happens come November.
Cleveland Mayor Justin Bibb, as always, we appreciate you making time to speak to us. Be safe and be well. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
We thank you for being with us at this hour.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.